Relations between the United States and Africa are at their most fragile point in decades. Trade deals are collapsing, diplomatic tensions are rising, and behind the scenes, Zambia is emerging as a critical player in the crisis. Why is Washington suddenly paying so much attention to Lusaka? What's driving African leaders to push back against American influence? And could Zambia be the country that decides how this geopolitical battle ends? Stay tuned. The answer might shock you. The relationship between the United States and Africa is facing unprecedented strain, and Zambia is right in the middle of it. From trade disputes and diplomatic standoffs to competition with China's growing influence, the stakes for Zambia have never been higher. In this investigative report, we reveal why U.S.-Africa ties are collapsing, how Zambia's economy and politics are directly affected, the growing role of China and other global players, what this could mean for Africa's future. This is more than just politics. It's a battle over resources, influence, and the future of global power. U.S.-Africa tensions boil over. Historical context of U.S.-Africa relations. The relationship between the United States and African nations has evolved significantly since the colonial era, shaped by Cold War dynamics, post-Cold War disengagement, and renewed interest in the 21st century. During the Cold War, Africa was a battleground for ideological influence, with the U.S. supporting anti-communist regimes, often overlooking authoritarianism, as seen in its backing of Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. The 1990s saw a decline in U.S. engagement as Africa was perceived as less strategically vital after the Soviet Union's collapse. However, the 2000s marked a shift, driven by counterterrorism concerns post-9/11, access to natural resources, and competition with emerging powers like China. The establishment of the United States Africa Command, AFRICOM, in 2007 symbolized this renewed focus, aiming to enhance security cooperation, promote stability, and counter threats like Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram. However, AFRICOM's launch sparked skepticism across Africa, with critics viewing it as a tool for militarizing U.S. policy and securing access to resources like oil and minerals. This perception persists, fueling tensions that occasionally boil over when U.S. actions are seen as infringing on African sovereignty or prioritizing American interests over African development. Current tensions, causes, and manifestations. U.S.-Africa tensions in 2025 stem from a complex interplay of geopolitical, economic, and ideological factors. Key issues include security-centric approach versus African priorities. The U.S. has prioritized counterterrorism and military cooperation through AFRICOM, often at the expense of addressing African priorities like economic development and governance. For instance, AFRICOM's focus on training African militaries to combat insurgencies has been criticized for neglecting civilian governance structures, leading to perceptions of neo-imperialism. African leaders, particularly in countries like South Africa and Nigeria, have expressed concerns that U.S. security assistance strengthens military institutions disproportionately, undermining democratic accountability. Trade and economic policies. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, enacted in 2000, provides duty-free access to the U.S. market for eligible African countries. While AGOA has boosted trade, its conditionalities, such as adherence to U.S.-defined democratic and human rights standards, have caused friction. For example, in 2023, the U.S. suspended Uganda from AGOA due to its anti-homosexuality law, prompting backlash from African nations who view such measures as coercive. This has led to accusations that the U.S. uses economic leverage to impose its values, straining relations. Geopolitical competition with China and Russia. The U.S. perceives China and Russia's growing influence in Africa as a strategic threat. China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and Russia's Wagner Group operations have expanded their footprints, offering African nations alternatives to U.S. partnerships. This competition has led to U.S. criticism of African governments for aligning with authoritarian powers, which many African leaders see as hypocritical given the U.S.'s history of supporting autocratic regimes when it suited its interests. Perceived double standards. African nations often criticize the U.S. for inconsistent application of its principles. For instance, while the U.S. condemns human rights abuses in countries like Zimbabwe, it maintains close ties with Rwanda, despite concerns about President Paul Kagame's authoritarianism. This selective engagement fuels distrust and perceptions of U.S. hypocrisy. Recent incidents, such as U.S. sanctions on African officials accused of corruption or human rights violations, have escalated tensions. In 2024, sanctions on Zimbabwean and Sudanese officials were met with accusations of neo-colonialism, with African Union (AU) leaders arguing that such measures undermine sovereignty. These tensions boil over when African nations push back against U.S. policies, as seen in Zambia's case, which we'll explore later. Case studies of tensions. South Africa and the Ukraine conflict. South Africa's neutral stance on the Russia-Ukraine war, including its participation in BRICS and hosting Russian President Vladimir Putin in 2023, irked the U.S., which sought African support for Ukraine. The U.S. threatened to review South Africa's AGOA status, prompting Pretoria to accuse Washington of bullying. Ethiopia and the Tigray conflict. U.S. sanctions on Ethiopian officials during the Tigray conflict 2020 to 2022 were seen as interfering in in domestic affairs, leading to Ethiopia's alignment with China and Russia for economic and military support. Nigeria and security cooperation. Nigeria's frustration with U.S. restrictions on arms sales due to human rights concerns has pushed it toward alternative suppliers like China, highlighting tensions over U.S. conditionalities. These cases illustrate a broader pattern. African nations increasingly demand partnerships based on mutual respect rather than U.S.-imposed conditions, leading to friction when expectations misalign. Why tensions persist? The persistence of tensions reflects structural issues. Asymmetry in power. The U.S., as a global superpower, often approaches Africa from a position of dominance, leading to perceptions of paternalism. Cultural misunderstandings. U.S. policies sometimes fail to account for Africa's diverse political, social, and cultural contexts, resulting in missteps that alienate partners. Competing visions. The U.S. promotes a liberal democratic model, while many African nations prioritize stability and development, often aligning with China's non-interference stance. In summary, U.S.-Africa tensions boil over due to a combination of historical mistrust, divergent priorities, and geopolitical rivalries. Addressing these requires the U.S. to adopt a more collaborative, less prescriptive approach, as we'll discuss in the future of U.S.-Africa relations. Why Zambia matters in global politics. Zambia's strategic importance. Zambia, a landlocked nation in southern Africa, has emerged as a pivotal player in global politics due to its strategic location, natural resources, and political stability. With a population of approximately 20 million and a GDP of $29 billion in 2024, Zambia is not among Africa's largest economies, but its influence stems from several factors. Critical minerals. Zambia is one of the world's top copper producers, accounting for about 10% of global supply. Copper is essential for renewable energy technologies, electric vehicles, and electronics, making Zambia a key player in the global energy transition. Its cobalt deposits, used in batteries, further elevate its importance. As demand for critical minerals grows, Zambia's mining sector attracts attention from the US, China, and the EU. Geopolitical positioning. Zambia's location at the crossroads of southern, central, and East Africa makes it a hub for regional trade and infrastructure. It borders 8 countries, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, a major source of cobalt and copper. Zambia's role in regional organizations like the Southern African Development Community, SADC, and the African Union, AU, amplifies its diplomatic influence. Political stability. Since its transition to multi-party democracy in 1991, Zambia has maintained relative stability, with peaceful power transitions, notably in 2021 when President Hakainde Hichilema defeated incumbent Edgar Lungu. This stability contrasts with regional neighbors like Zimbabwe and the DRC, making Zambia a reliable partner for Western and Eastern powers alike. China's influence. Zambia is a focal point for China's Belt and Road Initiative, with significant Chinese investments in infrastructure and mining. This has positioned Zambia as a battleground for U.S.-China competition, with the U.S. seeking to counterbalance China's influence through initiatives like the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII. Zambia's role in regional and global dynamics. Zambia's significance extends beyond its resources and geography. Regional mediator. Zambia has played a mediating role in regional conflicts, such as hosting peace talks for the DRC and supporting SADC peacekeeping missions. Its diplomatic neutrality enhances its credibility as a regional stabilizer. Economic gateway. Zambia's membership in the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, positions it as a gateway for trade in southern Africa. Its infrastructure, including the Tazara Railway, built with Chinese support, facilitates regional connectivity. Climate and energy transition. Zambia's hydropower potential, e.g., the Kariba Dam, and mineral wealth align with global climate goals. It has attracted investments in renewable energy, with the US and EU promoting green partnerships to counter China's dominance. Zambia in US-China rivalry. Zambia's strategic importance is amplified by the US-China rivalry. China has invested over $10 billion in Zambia since 2000, primarily in mining and infrastructure, but this has led to debt concerns, with Zambia defaulting on a $42.5 million Eurobond payment in 2020. The US has seized this opportunity to position itself as a better partner, offering debt restructuring support through the G7's Common Framework and promoting transparent investments. For instance, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, DFC, committed $300 million in 2023 for Zambia's renewable energy sector, signaling a shift towards sustainable partnerships. However, Zambia's balancing act, maintaining ties with both powers, underscores its global relevance. President Hichilema's government has welcomed U.S. investments while preserving relations with China, reflecting a pragmatic approach to maximize benefits from both sides. Challenges to Zambia's influence. Despite its importance, Zambia faces challenges. Debt burden. Zambia's external debt, estimated at $13 billion in 2024, limits its economic maneuverability. Negotiations with creditors, including China, remain contentious. Corruption and governance. While Hichilema's administration has prioritized anti-corruption, legacy issues from previous regimes hinder investor confidence. Resource nationalism. Rising domestic pressure to nationalize mining assets could deter foreign investment. complicating Zambia's role in global supply chains. In conclusion, Zambia matters in global politics due to its mineral wealth, strategic location, and diplomatic stability. Its ability to navigate US-China competition, while advancing its development goals, positions it as a microcosm of Africa's broader geopolitical dynamics. Trade disputes and economic fallout. Overview of trade disputes in US-Africa relations. Trade disputes between the US and African nations, including Zambia, often arise from differing economic priorities and conditionalities attached to trade agreements. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, is a cornerstone of US-Africa trade, offering duty-free access to the US market for over 1,800 products from 32 eligible African countries, including Zambia. However, disputes over eligibility criteria, intellectual property rights, and market access have led to economic fallout, affecting African economies and US-Africa relations. Key trade disputes. AGOA eligibility and conditionalities. AGOA's benefits are contingent on countries meeting US standards for democracy, human rights, and economic reforms. This has led to disputes such as Uganda suspension. 2023 Uganda was removed from AGOA due to its anti-homosexuality law, resulting in a loss of $100 million in annual exports. This sparked debates about US interference in African sovereignty. South Africa's neutrality. South Africa's refusal to align fully with US positions on global issues like the Russia-Ukraine war has led to threats of AGOA suspension, potentially costing South Africa $2 billion in annual trade. Zambia's compliance. Zambia has maintained AGOA eligibility, but its reliance on copper exports makes it vulnerable to global price fluctuations, complicating trade benefits. Intellectual property and pharmaceuticals. The US has pressured African nations to strengthen intellectual property laws, particularly for pharmaceuticals, to protect American companies. This conflicts with Africa's need for affordable generics, as seen in disputes over HIV/AIDS drug patents in the 2000s, which strained US-South Africa relations. Market access barriers. African exporters face non-tariff barriers, such as stringent US sanitary and phytosanitary standards, which limit agricultural exports. For Zambia, this affects its potential to export processed foods, despite AGOA's incentives. Economic fallout. The economic consequences of trade disputes are significant. Export losses. Suspension from AGOA, as seen in Uganda and Ethiopia, leads to immediate export revenue losses, impacting GDP and employment. For Zambia, any disruption in AGOA access could affect its textile and agricultural sectors, which employ thousands. Investment uncertainty. Trade disputes create uncertainty for investors, particularly in Zambia's mining sector, where US and Chinese firms compete. For example, a 2023 dispute over Zambia's mining tax regime led to a temporary halt in US investments, costing $500 million in planned projects. Debt and dependency. Trade disruptions exacerbate Africa's debt challenges. Zambia's debt restructuring efforts are tied to its ability to generate export revenue, and trade disputes with the US could hinder progress, increasing reliance on Chinese loans. Zambia-specific fallout. Zambia's economy is heavily dependent on copper exports, which account for 70% of its foreign exchange earnings. Trade disputes, particularly with the US, could disrupt supply chains. US tariffs or sanctions on Zambian copper due to geopolitical tensions, e.g., aligning with China, could destabilize its economy. Limit diversification. Zambia seeks to diversify into agriculture and manufacturing under AFCFTA, but US trade barriers could stifle these efforts. Increased debt risks. Reduced trade revenue could delay Zambia's debt restructuring, prolonging economic instability. Mitigating trade disputes. To reduce fallout, both sides could revise AGOA conditionalities. The US could adopt more flexible criteria, focusing on economic outcomes rather than ideological alignment. Enhance dialogue. Platforms like the US-Africa Leaders Summit could address trade grievances, fostering mutual understanding. Support diversification. US investments in Zambia's non-mining sectors, such as agribusiness, could reduce reliance on copper and mitigate trade risks. In summary, trade disputes between the US and Africa, including Zambia, stem from conditionalities and competing priorities, leading to economic fallout that undermines development. Addressing these requires pragmatic, mutually beneficial trade policies. China's strategic role in Africa. Historical context of China-Africa relations. China's engagement with Africa dates back to the 1950s, when it supported anti-colonial movements and built infrastructure like the Tazara Railway in Zambia and Tanzania. Since the 2000s, China's Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) has transformed its role, making it Africa's largest trading partner and a major investor. By 2024, China-Africa trade reached $282 billion, surpassing US-Africa trade $64 billion. Strategic objectives. China's role in Africa is driven by resource security. Africa supplies critical minerals, e.g., Zambia's copper, DRC's cobalt, and energy, e.g., Nigeria's oil, for China's industrial and green energy needs. Market access. Africa's growing population, 1.4 billion in 2025, offers a vast market for Chinese goods, from electronics to textiles. Geopolitical influence. China seeks African support in international forums like the UN, where Africa holds 54 votes. Its non-interference policy resonates with African leaders wary of Western conditionalities. Infrastructure dominance. Through the BRI, China builds roads, railways, and ports, enhancing its economic and strategic footprint. China's role in Zambia. Zambia exemplifies China's strategic approach. Mining investments. Chinese firms like China Non-Ferrous Metal Mining Corporation (CNMC) own significant stakes in Zambia's copper mines, contributing 20% of its output. These investments have boosted production, but raised concerns about labor conditions and environmental impacts. Infrastructure. China has financed projects like the Lusaka dual carriageway and the Kafue Gorge Lower Hydropower Project, totaling $2 billion. These enhance Zambia's connectivity and energy capacity, but increase its debt to China, $6 billion in 2024. Debt dynamics. Zambia's 2020 debt default highlighted its reliance on Chinese loans. China's role in debt restructuring via the G20's common framework has been cautious, prioritizing repayment over forgiveness, which has strained bilateral ties. Impacts of China's role. Economic growth. Chinese investments have driven GDP growth in Zambia, 4.5% in 2024, and other African nations, creating jobs and infrastructure. Debt trap concerns. Critics argue China's loans create dependency, with 60% of Zambia's external debt owed to Chinese creditors. However, China disputes the debt trap narrative, emphasizing mutual benefits. Geopolitical leverage. China's non-interference stance allows African nations to resist Western pressure, as seen in Zambia's balanced diplomacy with the US and China. Social and environmental costs. Chinese projects often face criticism for poor labor practices and environmental degradation, prompting protests in Zambia's Copperbelt region. China versus US in Africa. China's approach contrasts with the US. Non-interference versus conditionalities. China avoids imposing political reforms, unlike the US, which ties aid to democracy and human rights. Infrastructure versus soft power. China prioritizes physical infrastructure, while the US focuses on soft power, e.g. education, health programs. Scale of engagement. China's trade and investment dwarf US efforts, giving it an edge in economic influence. However, China's dominance faces challenges. Backlash against debt. African nations, including Zambia, are re-evaluating Chinese loans due to repayment pressures. Competition from others. The EU, India, and Turkey are increasing their African investments, diluting China's monopoly. Local resistance. Anti-Chinese sentiment, driven by labor disputes and cultural misunderstandings, has led to protests in Zambia and elsewhere. Future of China's role. China is likely to deepen its African engagement, focusing on green energy, digital infrastructure, e.g. 5G networks, and AFCFTA opportunities. In Zambia, China may shift towards sustainable investments to counter US and EU competition. However, addressing local concerns and balancing debt dynamics will be critical. In conclusion, China's strategic role in Africa, particularly Zambia, is defined by resource access, infrastructure development, and geopolitical influence. While it offers significant benefits, challenges like debt and local resistance require careful management. Zambia's political response. Zambia's political landscape. Zambia's political response to US-Africa tensions and China's influence is shaped by its democratic framework and pragmatic foreign policy. Since President Hakainde Hichilema's election in 2021, Zambia has pursued a pro-Western tilt while maintaining ties with China, reflecting a delicate balancing act. Response to US-Africa tensions. Zambia has navigated US-Africa tensions by engaging with AGOA. Zambia has complied with AGOA requirements, securing $50 million in annual exports to the US, mostly textiles and agricultural products. Hichilema's government has emphasized governance reforms to maintain eligibility, welcoming US investments. The US DFC's $300 million investment in renewable energy aligns with Zambia's climate goals, signaling openness to US partnerships. Critiquing US conditionalities. While maintaining diplomatic ties, Zambia has joined AU calls for less prescriptive US policies, advocating for trade agreements that prioritize African agency. Response to China's influence. Zambia's response to China includes debt restructuring. Hichilema has prioritized renegotiating Zambia's $6 billion debt to China, securing a partial agreement in 2023. This reflects a cautious approach to reduce dependency without alienating Beijing. Diversifying partnerships. Zambia has courted US, EU, and Indian investments to counterbalance China's dominance, particularly in mining and infrastructure. Addressing local concerns. Protests against Chinese mining practices have prompted stricter regulations, such as mandating local employment in Chinese-funded projects. Domestic political dynamics. Hichilema's United Party for National Development (UPND) has leveraged Zambia's strategic importance to bolster domestic legitimacy. Anti-corruption drive. Hichilema's anti-corruption campaign, targeting Lunguera mismanagement, aligns with US priorities, attracting Western support. Economic reforms. Policies to diversify the economy and reduce debt resonate with both US and Chinese partners, enhancing Zambia's bargaining power. Public sentiment. Anti-Chinese sentiment in the Copperbelt has pushed Hichilema to adopt adopt a nationalist stance, balancing foreign partnerships with domestic demands. Challenges and opportunities. Challenges. Zambia risks alienating China if it leans too heavily toward the U.S., while over-reliance on Western aid could undermine its sovereignty. Domestic pressure for resource nationalism complicates foreign investment. Opportunities. Zambia's diplomatic neutrality and mineral wealth position it to extract concessions from both powers, as seen in its successful debt restructuring talks. In summary, Zambia's political response is characterized by pragmatic diplomacy, balancing U.S. and Chinese interests while advancing domestic reforms. Its ability to maintain this balance will shape its global role. The future of U.S.-Africa relations. Emerging trends. The future of U.S.-Africa relations hinges on addressing current tensions and adapting to Africa's evolving priorities. Key trends include shift to economic partnerships. The U.S. is moving beyond security-centric policies, with initiatives like the PGII aiming to rival China's BRI. Investments in digital infrastructure, renewable energy, and AFCFTA integration are priorities. Youth and technology. Africa's youthful population, 60% under 25, and growing tech ecosystem offer opportunities for U.S. engagement in education, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Climate cooperation. The U.S. is prioritizing climate partnerships, with programs like Power Africa expanding renewable energy access, aligning with African needs. Opportunities for improvement. To strengthen relations, the U.S. could reform AGOA, simplifying eligibility criteria and reducing conditionalities would enhance trade benefits and reduce tensions. Invest in human capital. Expanding programs like the Young African Leaders Initiative (YALI) could build long-term goodwill. Counter China strategically. Rather than criticizing China, the U.S. could offer competitive, transparent investments, as seen in Zambia's renewable energy sector. Challenges. Geopolitical rivalries. Competition with China and Russia will continue to complicate U.S. engagement as African nations leverage multiple partners. Domestic politics. U.S. domestic priorities, such as economic protectionism, could limit Africa-focused investments. Perceptions of hypocrisy. Addressing double standards in human rights and governance policies is crucial to rebuilding trust. Zambia's role in shaping relations. Zambia's balanced approach offers a model for U.S.-Africa engagement. Its success in attracting U.S. investments while maintaining Chinese partnerships suggests a path for cooperative, non-zero-sum relations. The U.S. could use Zambia as a case study to refine its Africa strategy, focusing on mutual benefits. Scenarios for 2030. Optimistic scenario. The U.S. adopts a collaborative approach, increasing investments in African infrastructure and technology, leading to stronger ties and reduced tensions. Pessimistic scenario. Continued U.S. conditionalities and geopolitical rivalries push African nations toward China and Russia, marginalizing U.S. influence. Realistic scenario. A mixed outcome, with the U.S. gaining ground in strategic sectors like critical minerals and tech, but facing ongoing challenges in aligning with African priorities. In conclusion, the future of U.S.-Africa relations depends on the U.S.'s ability to adapt to Africa's needs, reduce prescriptive policies, and compete effectively with other powers. Zambia's role as a strategic partner highlights the potential for positive outcomes. Conclusion and what to watch next. Conclusion. U.S.-Africa tensions reflect a complex interplay of historical mistrust, competing priorities, and geopolitical rivalries. Zambia's strategic importance, driven by its minerals, stability, and diplomacy, makes it a focal point for U.S.-China competition and a bellwether for broader U.S.-Africa relations. Trade disputes, while causing economic fallout, can be mitigated through reformed policies and dialogue. China's strategic role, while transformative, poses challenges like debt and local resistance, which Zambia is addressing through pragmatic reforms. The future of U.S.-Africa relations hinges on mutual respect and strategic investments, with Zambia offering a model for balanced partnerships. What to watch next. Zambia's debt restructuring. Progress in negotiations with China and Western creditors will shape Zambia's economic stability and global influence. U.S.-China competition. Monitor U.S. investments in Africa's critical minerals and China's response, particularly in Zambia and the DRC. AGOA reauthorization. The 2025 AGOA renewal will indicate whether the U.S. adopts a more flexible approach to trade. African agency. Watch how African nations, including Zambia, leverage AFCFTA and regional diplomacy to assert greater control over their partnerships. Climate and technology. U.S. and Chinese investments in Africa's green energy and digital sectors will influence geopolitical alignments.